Emma Woodhouse. Handsome, clever, and rich. And a total snob, right? I mean, we're talking about the girl who thinks she's too fine to hang out with a farmer's wife, looks down on anyone with family in trade, and makes fun of a poor woman in front of others simply because she can. And just like Pride and Prejudice is Mr. Darcy, Emma needs to learn a lesson about her snobbery before she can have her happy ending. After all, if snobbish characters like Lady Catherine de Bourgh and Sir Walter Elliot and marriages like those in Pride and Prejudice have told us one thing, it's that Austen didn't pay much importance to disparities of wealth and status, and she considered those who did ridiculous. Right? Well, it's not that easy. Why is part of Emma's happy ending abandoning the friendship to the socially inferior Harriet? Why is Robert Martin never invited to any social gatherings, not even by Mr. Knightley, who holds him in high esteem, and is the one to check Emma's snobbery? And is anyone in the novel actually interested in changing the unequal society in Highbury? The question of social class in Emma is actually much more nuanced and complex than it might appear on first glance. It's worth taking a closer look at to try to answer the question, was Jane Austen a progressive social critic, or perhaps a classist conservative herself? And can we even answer this question based on one novel? If you want to find out, you've come to the right place. Buckle up, this is going to be a bit of a long one. When reading about Austen and class, you'll often see people say that Austen wrote mainly about one specific class called the gentry. In terms of the English class system, the gentry is located below the peerage and forms part of the local elite, or upper class if you want. That means that their social standing is not as high as that of peers like a duke or earl, but they are higher up the social ladder than, say, your average shopkeeper. But what makes one part of the gentry, or genteel? This is where things get interesting. Classic examples of the gentry are landowners like Mr. Knightley, who did not need to work a regular job because their estate generated enough income. At the same time, there were professions that were considered genteel: the army, the navy, the clergy, the law, with a few caveats. This is why Mr. Elton, a vicar, or Mr. John Knightley, a barrister, are considered gentlemen as well. But the term gentleman also increasingly referred to someone who lived a lifestyle and showed conduct that was considered gentlemanly, similarly to the way we use the term today, which is of course way less specific. So the lines of who is and is not genteel are often a little blurred in Jane Austen. You can see this when looking at the society of Highbury. Most of the main characters in Emma are genteel, but they are living very different lives in very different economic situations. Mr. Knightley, for example, who technically lives in the neighboring parish, owns almost all the land in Highbury, and the Woodhouses have a fortune from other sources that makes them almost as rich. Emma has an impressive dowry of £30,000, which she could theoretically live off comfortably for the rest of her life. For comparison, the Bennet sisters in Pride and Prejudice, whose future would be way more precarious, have £1,000 each. Meanwhile, the Bateses, at the lower end of Highbury's gentry, are genteel because they are the widow and daughter of a former vicar, but they are comparably poor and somewhat reliant on the kindness of their wealthier neighbors. You might remember that they receive frequent gifts, for example, apples from Mr. Knightley or a pig's hindquarter from the Woodhouses. This is because, with the late vicar's death, they lost most of their income, and propriety forbade genteel women to work. This is of course a problem for Jane Fairfax, who is about to become a governess, which would mean a further loss of social status. Just as people can lose their genteel status, they can also become genteel, for example by making money in trade and eventually buying their own estate, as Mr. Weston has done. Mrs. Elton is from a merchant family, but becomes genteel by marrying a vicar, and the wealthy Coles might be of low origin and trade, but their accumulated wealth and fancy lifestyle have helped them to become already moderately genteel enough to invite the established gentry such as Mr. Knightley to their gatherings. As you can see, there is some fluidity involved in the category of gentility. Now you might be wondering, why does this even matter? Who cares what someone's parents did for a living or how someone makes their money? Well, the characters in Austen's novels do for sure, and once you start paying attention to it, You will notice that class is the basis for most of the social interactions and relationships in the novel, from friendships and marriages to general socializing and charity. For example, the genteel Jane Fairfax is considered a suitable friend for Emma, while both Mr. Knightley and Mrs. Weston voice concerns about her friendship with the non-genteel Harriet. The Westons dream of a match between the genteel Frank Churchill and Emma, and Mr. Knightley thinks the non-genteel Harriet and Robert Martin are well suited for each other, but the genteel Mr. Elton is offended by the idea of marrying the non-genteel Harriet. When it comes to social relationships, class at least partly overrides personal preferences and wealth and lifestyle. Miss Bates might be poor and very talkative, but she receives regular visits, invitations, and gifts from the wealthier genteel people in the novel. Meanwhile, Mr. Woodhouse talks highly of Dr. Perry, and Mr. Knightley expresses great respect for Robert Martin, but neither man is invited to social gatherings like the outing to Box Hill or the strawberry picking party at Donwell Abbey. There are social events where gentry and non-gentry mix, but they come with at least some concerns about class. For example, when planning the ball at the Crown Inn, Emma and Frank discuss the want of proper families in the place, and how everybody should be returning into their proper place the next morning. Now, this doesn't mean that money doesn't count at all, or that all genteel people are treated equally. Mr. Elton clearly has no issue marrying a non-genteel woman if, like Mrs. Elton, she brings a lot of money to the relationship. And Jane Fairfax and Frank Churchill are both genteel, but worried his parents won't approve of the relationship, as they are at opposite ends of their class. But class is still an important factor that sort of keeps the system together. It prevents poor gentry like the Bateses from fully descending into the lower classes, because the other genteel people still include them in their activities, and it prevents people like the Coles from rising to the top of the hierarchy too quickly. You will also notice that none of the characters in the novel, not even those who suffer from it in some way, ever question this class system itself. They generally accept, or learn to accept, their place in life, and accept that there are class-based rules about who to marry, befriend, or associate with. The conflicts in the novel only lie in the question of how to draw the line between the classes, and how to interpret these social rules. The main character to mess with this delicate system is, of all people, Emma, otherwise one of its staunchest upholders. And because class is important in Highbury, and Emma is one of the most socially influential people in that community, her offenses have the potential to create quite the mess. Let's look at the three major ones, and how they create or at least complicate the main conflicts in the novel. Emma's matchmaking plans for Harriet, the way she neglects Jane Fairfax, and her disrespect of Miss Bates. Let's start with Emma's matchmaking for Harriet, arguably the social mistake with the gravest consequences. Harriet Smith is a parlor boarder, sort of the posher, more luxurious version of a boarding school student at the local girls' school. She is an illegitimate child, and, as we learn by the end of the novel, the daughter of a tradesman. Even though her father seems to be fairly wealthy, this means that she is not genteel. And then comes Emma. Emma decides that Harriet is a gentleman's daughter, and therefore genteel herself. Conveniently, this makes Harriet a suitable friend for Emma, who otherwise seems to be kind of lonely because she's the only genteel young woman in Highbury, except for Jane Fairfax, who she doesn't like. That's the downside of being a genteel lady in the countryside, a very limited social circle. To keep her friend in her social circle, Emma needs her to marry not the farmer Robert Martin, but a gentleman. And this is where the chaos starts. Let's recap the consequences of Emma's matchmaking plan. She convinces Harriet to reject poor Robert Martin, which temporarily breaks his heart and ruins Harriet's friendship with his sisters. It also puts Harriet in quite some financial danger, because she was not educated for a particular profession, but because of her family situation, she also has no known dowry that she could live off forever like Emma, or that could entice someone to marry her. Emma basically ruins a really good, and possibly the best marriage opportunity that Harriet will ever have. Her matchmaking plan for Harriet and Mr. Elton backfires, and Mr. Elton proposes to her instead. This breaks Harriet's heart, and offends Emma, who feels that a mere vicar with family and trade is beneath her, genteel or not. Her rejection and revelation of her matchmaking plan in turn mortally offend Mr. Elton, creating tension between him and both Harriet and Emma, which eventually leads to that fateful scene during the ball, where Mr. Elton refuses to dance with Harriet, so Mr. Knightley does instead. Now, Emma has not given up her matchmaking plan yet. Oh no. She now encourages Harriet's crush on what she believes to be Frank Churchill, which, if you think about it, is an even wilder plan in terms of class, as Frank is even farther up the social ladder than Mr. Elton. This fuels another major misunderstanding, which also involves Emma herself. Unbeknownst to her, Mr. Knightley is trying to get to know Harriet as Emma's friend, and Harriet, encouraged by Emma, mistakes this for romantic interest. This, in turn, devastates Emma when she thinks she's about to lose the man she finally realizes she loves to Harriet. As we all know, everyone eventually gets a happy ending, but man, the drama. Can you imagine there are people who say that nothing happens in Emma? Okay, let's move on. Emma's behavior towards Jane Fairfax is definitely less dramatic, but here too there are a few interesting points regarding social class. Jane is in a tricky position when it comes to class. She is genteel by birth, and she was raised by the wealthy Colonel Campbell, so she is accustomed to a nice genteel lifestyle. She is well educated and described as very elegant, which even Emma, who doesn't particularly like her, has to admit. However, like her relatives the Bateses, Jane is rather poor. Her options are basically to get married, or to work in one of the few professions that were considered acceptable for a gentlewoman, in her case becoming a governess, which would still mean losing her current social status. She is engaged to the wealthy Frank Churchill, but the two hide their relationship for most of the book because they are afraid that the Churchills won't approve of Jane's lower social status. So, in some way, she's too genteel to work, and not genteel enough to marry her fiancé. You really can't win as a gentlewoman, can you? Jane is a good example of how, in this social system, gentility demands respect from other genteel people, especially when you're at the lower end of the class. For example, Mr. Weston warns Frank, "Any want of attention to her here should be carefully avoided. You saw her with the Campbells when she was the equal of everybody she mixed with, but here she is with a poor old grandmother who has barely enough to live on. If you do not call early, it will be a slight." In other words, precisely because Jane is in such a precarious situation, she deserves extra attention from the rest of the gentry. So, what does Emma think about Jane Fairfax? She reluctantly admires Jane's elegance, good manners, and education, and she knows that Jane is the only other genteel young woman in Highbury, and therefore the most obvious choice of a friend, or at least someone she should hang out with from time to time. Let's face it, even the patient Jane would probably like a break from her aunt from time to time, and Emma could provide that. But is that what Emma does? Of course not. Instead, in her own words, she is sick of the very name of Jane Fairfax, because Miss Bates is constantly talking about her, and seems reluctant to even try to get to know her. Even worse, she gossips about Jane to Frank, sharing suspicions that could potentially ruin Jane's reputation if they spread and people will believe them. If there are duties that genteel people have towards each other, and especially to the poorer genteel, it seems fair to say that Emma violates them. Now, in Jane's case, Emma's behavior does not have as many obvious negative consequences as with Harriet, but there are a few what-ifs to consider. For example, had Emma made an effort to befriend Jane, she might not have felt the need to befriend Harriet, which would have prevented all those problems. Hadn't she been so busy disliking Jane, she might have been more likely to believe Mr. Knightley when he told her about his suspicions that there is something going on between Jane and Frank. And had she actually been friends with Jane, or at least more friendly towards her, then either Jane or Frank might have even confided in her about their engagement. Frank later admits in his letter that he thought about doing so. And had Emma known about this engagement, or at least suspected it, she would likely not have flirted with Frank in front of poor Jane, which would also have saved Mr. Knightley the misunderstanding of believing Emma in love with Frank. So, once again, Emma might have made everyone's life a little easier by following the recommended relationships of her class. Emma's most obvious, and one could say most aggressive offense when it comes to social class is her behavior towards Miss Bates. As we've seen, the Bateses are at the lower end of the gentry. They live, in a very small way, in a rented apartment, and the richer genteel people help them out from time to time, for example by offering their carriage or sending them food. Unlike most of the other genteel characters, the Bateses regularly associate not only with the rest of the gentry, but also with non-genteel people, like the Coles, the Coxes, and the Perrys, possibly because they live closer to them, both physically and in terms of class, or because they are not in the position to host their own gatherings, so they kind of rely on what they can get socially. One pretty telling sign for their lower social status is when the Coles invite all the other genteel characters to dinner, and Miss Bates and Jane are only invited to come after dinner, together with what is termed the less worthy females. Ouch. Nevertheless, the Bateses are genteel and are treated as such. The other genteel people regularly visit or invite them. Miss Bates is included in every bigger social gathering, and, as with Jane, there seems to be an unspoken agreement to treat her with even more respect and consideration because of her poverty and relatively low social status. There's a high chance that everyone finds her annoying from time to time, and we know from private conversations that Mrs. Weston and Mr. Knightley do, but they never show it. Emma, however, does not like Miss Bates, because she is too good-natured and too silly to suit her, and she is in horror of being in danger of falling in with the second-rate and third-rate of Highbury, who were calling on them forever. So she often neglects what she knows would be her duty to visit the Bateses. She also shows disrespect for Miss Bates by talking badly about her to Frank, and making fun of her in conversation with Mrs. Weston. Her biggest offense, however, obviously occurs on Box Hill, when she basically tells Miss Bates that her conversation is always extremely dull. Now, this might be something that many of the other characters would quietly agree with, but by actually voicing it, Emma insults Miss Bates to her face in front of almost all of their genteel peers. This is not only a huge breach of decorum in general, but also of that unspoken rule that demands particular respect for Miss Bates because of her delicate social position. Mr. Knightley says as much when he lectures Emma. Were she a woman of fortune, I would leave every harmless absurdity to take its chance. I would not quarrel with you for any liberties of manner. Were she your equal in situation, but Emma, consider how far this is from being the case. She is poor. She has sunk from the comforts she was born to, and, if she lived to old age, must probably sink more. Her situation should secure your compassion. It was badly done indeed. Emma's remark does not have grave consequences in the novel, as Miss Bates seems to forgive her, but Mr. Knightley gives Emma an important warning. Because of her high social status, she has considerable influence on her community. People look up to her, listen to her, and might take her behavior as an example. Essentially, he's telling her that with great power comes great responsibility. One interesting point to get us closer to our title question is, why is Emma wrong to act like that? Your immediate response might be, well, because she's a snob. She thinks she's better than everyone else because she was born rich, thinks the Mardens must be illiterate and vulgar just because they are farmers, and remember this part where she talks about the poor? A very narrow income has a tendency to contract the mind and sour the temper. Those who can barely live, and who live perforce in a very small and generally very inferior society, may well be illiberal and cross. Pretty ironic considering how illiberal and cross Emma herself can be. You can take this a step further and argue that Emma actively works against the principles of social fluidity that other characters seem to consider normal. She doesn't like visiting Miss Bates because this would mean associating with the lower classes by proxy. She doesn't accept the Mardens as a respectable, educated, and fairly wealthy family. She thinks the Coles shouldn't be allowed to invite their social superiors for dinner, and she judges people for having family in trade. In all these attitudes, she is pretty much alone among the genteel people in the novel, but if things went her way, it would be very hard, if not impossible, for anyone to rise in this kind of society. If we move away from our modern moral standpoint, though, and only look at what is happening in the novel, there is another way of reading this. Highbury has a certain social hierarchy, with the Woodhouses and Mr. Knightley on top, varying degrees of gentility, and plenty of non-genteel people, reaching down to servants and the poor that Emma and Harriet visit at one point in the novel. Now, a system like this relies on certain mechanisms that keep it intact. In the case of Jane Austen's novels, that could be that A. The gentry lead by example and use their wealth and influence responsibly and for the good of the community, and B. The middle class has the opportunity to eventually become part of the upper class themselves. This way, those below the gentry might not complain about the unequal distribution of wealth and power because they hope to profit from it eventually. A bit like those people who defend billionaires because they believe they will be the 0.0001% who will become one too. We see this ideal in Mr. Knightley, who is charitable towards the Bateses and considers the needs of Highbury's inhabitants when moving a footpath on his own land, and in characters like Mr. Weston and the Coles, who slowly and unassumingly gain their wealth and status. Emma, however, consistently disrespects the system and threatens the established social order. With Harriet, she tries to raise someone into the ranks of gentility more quickly than the system allows, while with Jane and Miss Bates, she doesn't respect the mechanisms that are supposed to keep the poor genteel from fully losing their status. With Harriet and Miss Bates specifically, Emma also abuses her social power and, like Mr. Knightley warns her, is a bad example for the rest of the gentry. So, depending on how you read the novel, the main problem with Emma's behavior is not that she insists on class distinctions or is proud of her own high social standing, but that she threatens the social order that keeps her own kind on top, both by trying to elevate someone who hasn't earned it and by alienating those below her on whose acceptance and respect her own high status relies. This reading would explain, for example, why part of the happy ending is the end of Emma's friendship with Harriet, who returns to her own class. Okay, folks. The time has finally come to return to our clickbaity title question. Is Emma a socially progressive work, or perhaps conservative propaganda for the class system? For both of these extremes, there is critical literature to support such a reading. So, let's look at them both. Now, it's undeniable that Emma is not a literally revolutionary novel where Highbury's lower classes rebel against the gentry, seize their assets, and start a democratic local government or something. But there are a few egalitarian tendencies nonetheless. For one, the novel is clearly critical of abuse of power, and, through Emma, shows the dangers of giving one person too much unchecked social power. You could even argue that, in the case of both Emma and Mrs. Elton, it is specifically being idle rich and being handed your high social status without having earned it that leads to a snobbish attitude and feelings of superiority towards others. Another point is that, when looking at positive qualities like kindness, moral integrity, or responsibility, it's not only those on top of the social hierarchy, or even only genteel people who display them. Robert Martin seems to be quite intelligent, capable, and dignified. Miss Bates might be annoying, but she's also pure kindness, and more perceptive than she appears at first. And poor Jane is way more patient and forgiving than Frank deserves. Meanwhile, Mr. Woodhouse is quite self-involved and silly with his hypochondria. Frank is, at times, irresponsible and disrespectful towards his father, stepmother, and most of all Jane. And Emma, well, we talked about Emma. You could argue that Emma's main mistakes lie in paying too much attention to class distinctions and her own feelings of superiority, and that her main learnings in the novel are to see and appreciate someone's personal qualities instead, qualities which might eventually make that person deserving of higher social status. This would explain why none of the other characters seem to have a problem with associating with Miss Bates, or disapprove of characters like Mrs. Elton or the Coles rising into gentility, except maybe because of Mrs. Elton's awful behavior, and why Robert Martin is not only respected and well liked by Mr. Knightley, but also invited to dinner and the theatre by John and Isabella Knightley at the end of the novel. It does, however, not answer all the questions. For example, why Harriet's happy ending includes her being removed from the genteel social circle again, at which no one seems to bat an eye, or why not even Mr. Knightley makes an effort to include the apparently deserving Robert Martin in the gentry social gatherings in Highbury. In the end, it seems, everyone returns to their rightful place. This leads us to the opposite theory, the one that reads Emma as proof that Austen essentially accepted and supported the English class system, as long as the socially powerful, like Emma, fulfilled their duties towards their social inferiors, like Miss Bates. This is connected to the idea that Emma's mistakes are mistakes because they threaten the established social order, and thus the gentry's claim to their place on top of that order. Following this theory, all conflicts in the novel stem from an individual problem, Emma's lack of understanding of her role and responsibilities in society, and can be solved from within the system, by Mr. Knightley teaching her, while the class system itself is not to blame for anything. On the contrary, the generous, responsible, kind Mr. Knightley shows the good that the class system can do if the right people are in power, and nothing major needs to change for the ending to be happy. On the one hand, this theory would answer some of our open questions. Robert Martin isn't invited anywhere, and Harriet is removed from the genteel social circle in the happy ending because Emma's mistake was never not wanting to associate with the Martins, but being friends with Harriet and trying to make her genteel. The importance of class distinctions and class solidarity would also be why Emma is taught to treat Jane and Miss Bates with particular respect and attention, while all that is ever demanded from her regarding non-genteel people is to not meddle in their affairs. This reading would also explain why the silly, unreasonable, or bad-mannered characters in the novel are mostly those who disrespect the class system or do not fulfill their social duty of being a good example. The Eltons with their presumptuous attitude and disrespect of their social inferiors, Harriet with her naive dream of marrying a gentleman, Frank Churchill, Mr. Woodhouse, and, of course, Emma. Meanwhile, characters like Jane Fairfax, who seems to accept the idea of becoming a governess, albeit reluctantly, and Robert Martin, who never lays any claims to gentility, are portrayed as sensible and respectable. On the other hand, this reading too has its problems. It often relies on the idea that Austen conveys an idealized image of the gentry, especially in the form of Mr. Knightley. And sure, he might be almost as ideal as it gets, but he is also the only genteel person in the novel that could reasonably be described as ideal. Except for Emma, who helps the poor but clearly thinks badly of them, we don't see any other genteel character working actively for the benefit of their community. Frank is busy hiding his engagement and hurting Jane by flirting with Emma right in front of her. Mr. Woodhouse isn't even a good host in his own home because he's too worried about everyone else's health, and Mr. Elton abandons his planned visit to the poor as soon as he meets Emma on his way. This rather brings us back to the theory that positive qualities are distributed across the classes in Austen's novels. This theory also leaves the question of what to make of the social issues that Austen addresses that are not caused by Emma or any specific character. As other Austen novels, Emma discusses the difficult situation of impoverished gentlewomen like the Bateses and Jane, struggling to get by, but prevented from supporting themselves. This is clearly something that is caused by the general system in which most upper-class women depended on men for financial support, were not educated in a way that allowed them to support themselves financially, and were punished with the loss of social status if they did. Isn't it proof of Austen's progressive social criticism that she addresses this issue so clearly? Well, it could be, but there also is a different argument. By the end of the novel, similarly to Pride and Prejudice, where the Bennet sisters would have been in danger of experiencing a similar fate as Miss Bates, these underlying issues don't matter anymore. Miraculously, Jane's, and by extension likely the Bateses', problems are solved, because she is married to the very wealthy Frank Churchill. Yay! You could see this as Austen simply wanting to give her characters a happy ending, but you could also argue that she downplays a real, systemic problem by pretending that the ideal solution lies, once again, in an individual taking responsibility and fulfilling their designated role in the system, rather than in anyone at least considering changing the system itself. Now, obviously, just like people's political stances in real life, this does not have to be a black and white thing. This might be a boring non-answer to an exciting clickbait question, but it would have been perfectly possible for Austen to criticize abuse of power and be accepting of the slow rise of people like the Westons and Coles into gentility, while also believing in the benefits of a class system, as long as those on top use their power responsibly, as Mr. Knightley does. Would that make her classist? or just a realist who knows there will be some sort of hierarchy anyway, so it might at least be led by responsible people. I leave it to you to decide. But before you make your decision, there are two caveats to consider in any interpretations of the novel. Many of the arguments I just shared rely on the idea that Emma learns certain lessons about her behavior and changes accordingly. But I am here to complicate things and ask, does Emma actually learn anything? Let's look at how exactly she acknowledges her mistakes in the cases of Harriet, Jane, and Miss Bates. When trying to make a match for Harriet, Emma has several setbacks. When Mr. Elton proposes to her instead, when she learns about Frank's secret engagement after encouraging Harriet's supposed crush on him, and finally, when she learns that Harriet is in love with Mr. Knightley and thinks he might be reciprocating her feelings. Only in the last instance does Emma finally begin to regret her matchmaking plans and her friendship with Harriet in general. Notably, though, her first reported thought after Harriet reveals her feelings is that Mr. Knightley must marry no one but herself, not that she should have let Harriet marry Robert Martin. Her opinion that a marriage between Harriet and Mr. Knightley would be such an elevation on her side, such a debasement on his, seems remarkably similar to when she called Jane Fairfax a very shameful and degrading connection for him. But she seems to have no issue accepting Jane's engagement to the equally wealthy and high-ranking Frank Churchill, just as she saw no problem in encouraging Harriet's supposed feelings for Frank shortly before. It seems at least possible that her own feelings for Mr. Knightley play a much bigger role in her change of heart about Harriet than an actual understanding of how and why she was wrong. Perhaps she's truly concerned now because, for once, her meddling might endanger her own happiness. Regarding Jane Fairfax, it says that Emma found amusement in detecting the real cause of the violent dislike of Mr. Knightley marrying Jane Fairfax, or anybody else, which at the time she had wholly imputed to the amiable solicitude of the sister and the aunt. So, Emma downplays her snobbish dislike of the Bateses and her general dislike of Jane, and blames all her behavior on her at that time unconscious feelings for Mr. Knightley. She does not even consider, for example, that she might have also felt threatened by how elegant and accomplished Jane is, more accomplished in many respects than Emma herself, and that she might also be kinder to Jane now that Jane will be moving away. This does not really sound like a lesson learned to me either. Emma's lesson about Miss Bates is obviously directly caused by Mr. Knightley, and literary critics often call his speech on Box Hill a turning point which cures Emma's snobbery. But does Emma truly learn a lesson? Or does she just change her behavior to please Mr. Knightley? Look at this passage from when she goes to visit Miss Bates the morning after Box Hill. It was not unlikely, she thought, that she might see Mr. Knightley in her way, or perhaps he might come in while she were paying her visit. She had no objection. She would not be ashamed of the appearance of the penitence, so justly and truly hers. Her eyes were towards Donwell as she walked, but she saw him not. She seems more concerned about proving her penitence to Mr. Knightley than actually feeling it. So, what does this mean for our political reading of the novel if Emma doesn't actually learn the lessons that are an important part of these readings? Maybe Austen still wanted her readers to learn these lessons. Or maybe she was cleverly and subtly saying that someone like Emma is unlikely to truly learn them, especially if her mistakes have no lasting consequences and she still gets her happy ending. And if the class system produces spoiled people like Emma who can do lasting harm with their social power and are unlikely to truly learn from their mistakes and understand their social responsibilities, that would paint a much more critical picture of the class system, one that questions the stability and benefits of such a system. Now, on to the next caveat, a classic from Literary Studies 101. If you've attended such a class or are just a critical reader, you might have been sitting here this whole time thinking, okay, that's all well and good, but just because characters say and do something in a book doesn't mean the author is expressing this opinion. And you would be absolutely right. It is tempting, for example, to take Mr. Knightley as the pinnacle of morality and measure Emma's actions against him, but he is, after all, not perfect himself. For example, he admits to being prejudiced against both Frank Churchill and Harriet, although he was ultimately right about Frank, so we cannot just always take his word for it. Similarly, we cannot just believe Austen's narrator when they say something. This is both because they can frequently be read as ironic. This is a common interpretation of that famous first line of Pride and Prejudice, for example. Or they are reporting a character's thoughts in a style called free and direct discourse, that basically fuses them with the narration, making it tricky to know who exactly is speaking or thinking. For example, at the very end of the novel, we learn that Harriet was less and less at Hartfield, which was not to be regretted. The intimacy between her and Emma must sink. Their friendship must change into a calmer sort of goodwill. And, fortunately, what ought to be and must be seemed already beginning, and in the most gradual, natural manner. Who is speaking here? Is this Emma's opinion, general society's opinion, the narrator's opinion, Austen's opinion? Anytime we try to attribute a certain political message to an Austen novel, we have to make decisions about these things. Which characters can we trust? Is this irony? Does the narrator express Austen's own opinion? And another reader might make totally different choices, resulting in a totally different interpretation. And who's to say either is more valid than the other? This might sound unsatisfying, but it's also the beauty of literary studies to me. So, what do you think? Is Emma a progressive or a conservative novel when it comes to social class? Or maybe something in between? Do you even feel like you can make a decision? Do you have any more questions or comments about social class in Emma? Let me know in the comments. Or should I say, talk Austen to me? Yes, I've been waiting forever to make this joke. Alright, that's it from me for today. If you want to see more awesome Austen videos, check out the Virtual JaneCon playlist, which I will link in the description. I will also link my bibliography and the transcript for this talk. If you want to see more of my content, you can find me on Instagram, Reddit, Twitter, and Tumblr under Talk Austen to Me, although I'm not very active at the moment. Thank you so much for watching this video. I'm looking forward to talking more Austen to you in the future.